Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show is the second in the wonderful Witchkin series by Wayne Harbison. As ever, please do let us know down below in the comments what you thought. Please do like and share and help build the channel and our community further. And of course, don't forget to hashtag Team Fear. Without further ado, let's get into tonight's story, entitled Shadows over Mobile Bay 2. Rise of the Painter. Let's get straight into that. It was a week later when I was once again ambulatory enough to do more than sit on the riverbank with my teddy and fish for bream and crappie and the occasional sunfish and smallmouth bass on the north shores of the Dog River, which was nearby to the house. Dr. Meacham had been correct. There were those who had watched us closely from the tree line on both sides of the river. I felt it best to take care of what business I could quickly, to keep danger as far away from my brother as possible. And so, on the following Thursday, I sent a message to my father's mother in Charleston and asked her to come and spend some time with us. In the meantime, I had other affairs to look after, not the least of which were the laying of the foundation of Bon Travel. The South, being laid to waste by the Union Army, had not only stripped it of its wealth and dignity, but had also stripped it of its able-bodied men. As I had indicated to Colonel Shepard, I was having to send to Europe not only to find suitable craftsmen to employ, but for the basic necessities of life. A gentleman's agreement between myself and Lucas Toomey, the shopkeeper on Dauphiny Street in Mobile, made him one of the few establishments where flour, sorted meat, even honey was available. As I was importing dry goods en masse, then at least the people here in Mobile were not going to die of privation. Conditions were going to be necessarily lean, but fortunately would not become famine. It was a week after the encounter with Colonel Shepard when Teddy and I were out for a stroll in the town. Teddy was slowly building up an endurance for using the articulated wooden leg we purchased for him through a catalogue. As the autumn temperatures began to drop, the agitation of the northern carpetbaggers and politicians in our fair city increased in some infernal inverse ratio. And with that agitation came a restlessness that had begun to show itself with violence and overt demonstrations of power. One particular bone of contention with the Union soldiers was that they were not allowed into general, genteel society. We as men may have fought them on the battlefield and eventually surrendered, but our womenfolk were made of much sterner stuff. This open disdain for the hated Yankee was usually displayed with a swishing to the side of the skirt as they passed the soldiers, as if they were passing something that was likely to soil their clothing. It did not sit well with most of the soldiers and almost none of the officers. One such officer, Lieutenant Turner, took a particular offence to this treatment and meant to demonstrate to them the raw power he exercised over their lives. He placed on the wooden walkway over either side of Lucas Toomey's shop a Union flag and meant to force a particular pair of young girls barely old enough to be presented as society to walk under them. As Teddy and I watched the display, the girls looked at each other and then stepped out into the street to avoid the hated symbol of our defeat. With a nod of Turner's head, several soldiers suddenly stepped up to the women, bayonets presented to force them back onto the walkway and under the flags. From across the street, as I glanced down at my brother, I said quietly, "Wait here." He nodded to me. "Be careful, Dan." "I will." Then I crossed the street, tipped my hat to the ladies, scowled at the soldiers and the lieutenant. "Ladies," I said in my most gentlemanly manner. "Captain McNaughton," one of the young girls said. I had not expected them to recognize me. Turner immediately turned to me and said, "You are no captain." I chuckled lowly and said, "And you are no gentleman." Ignoring him, I turned back to the ladies. "Might I have the honour of escorting you past these ruffians and, ne'er-do-wells?" "We would be the most honoured, Captain," the second woman said with a hateful smile at Turner. "I do believe you actually graduated from West Point, did you not?" I bowed my head slightly and said, I have had that honour. And served under General Lee? The first girl asked with glee. Again, I've had that honour, I told them. But the honour I have not had, and I'm afraid that I am in the position of being most ungentlemanly, is not having someone to introduce us, is that of knowing your names. I was playing the thespian, and the young ladies were more than willing to indulge me. I think under the circumstances, such requirements of society can be overlooked, the second young lady said. Then, indicating to her companion, she told me, "This is Sarah Forsyth." I bowed to her, as with much grace as I could muster. "I am also most charmed, Miss Forsyth." She nodded and smiled before saying, "And this is Mary Withers." Again, it is my greatest pleasure, Miss Withers. I noted that both were the names of former mayors of the city of Mobile before the war. As you seem to already know, I am Captain Sheridan McNaughton, formerly of Chateau de la Mer. From the corner of my eye, I noted the colour rise in the lieutenant's face. "Would you mind escorting us into the general store?" Miss Withers asked. "Not that there is much inside to purchase, but there are a few necessities no household can be without." "I would be most honoured," I told her. Then, looking at the men with their bayonets, I said, "Unless you intend to run me through with those, move." I projected my will into the world. The effect was most satisfying as they hurriedly backed away. One caught his heel on the wooden frame of the walkway and fell back into the lieutenant. It was more than I could have hoped for. Then, gesturing toward the general store, I said, "Ladies." I turned to Turner and his men and told him, "As military men, and I use the term loosely, you should know that your picket is at the end of the streets, not threatening schoolgirls with armed rifles and bayonets. I will be mentioning this most unseemly behaviour to Colonel Shepard when I next see him." It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless, and I buoyed the spirits of the young ladies. Upon returning to the outside of the store, I saw where the soldiers had withdrawn, and Turner was taking down the flags. I smiled at him and crossed the street to where Theodore was waiting. "I thought they were going to stab you, Dan." His voice trembled in fear at the thought. Putting an arm about his shoulder, I said, "Not likely. They are men of low regard and poor calibre, but they are not stupid. Even Turner knows enough not to let this kind of thing get out of hand. His pride was wounded, by the way how womenfolk treat him. Now, I'm afraid it's an open sore, but he's a coward at heart and not likely to cause any more disturbances here." I smiled and tousled his hair. "It's very likely that Colonel Shepard is going to find other duties for the lieutenant, so that he's less likely to get into mischief. And about that, I was right. By the end of the occupation, the man would find himself facing a court-martial, but for a far more severe offence." "We will never be free of these damn Yankees," Teddy asked seriously. "I won't lie to you, Theodore. Things are likely to become worse before they ever get any better. The signs out of Washington are not good. There is absolutely no counterbalance for the radical Republicans in Congress. They mean to have their pound of flesh and pint of blood and more." Teddy smiled up at me and banged his leg against the walkway railing. "I have already given up more than a pound, I think." "Well, I think you're right," I told him, not knowing what else to say. Returning home that night, and after Theodore had turned to his bed, I escorted Miss Beaumere to her home, several blocks away. It was somewhat scandalous for her to be out with a man, not her father or brother. But, to be honest, these difficult times call for difficult concessions to the rules of polite society. And, if I were to be perfectly honest with myself, I had become rather fond of the young lady who had done such a compliment of a job of acting in best interests, not only to my brother, but to my household as well. I was beginning to see the value in an arrangement, as I knew her mother was hoping, and as Dr. Meacham had suggested. Now, as we walked along the streets lit by sputtering coal gas lamps, Miss Beaumere said, "Theodore told me what you did for Sarah Forsyth and Mary Withers. Well, that's very brave of you." I smiled and said, "Not really. Turner and his men are men of low degree. They are cowards at heart, and felt the need to lord their power over defenceless young ladies. I do intend to have a conversation with the Colonel Shepard on the matter." I believe that the captain is too modest, she said with a slight hitch of tease to her voice. Perhaps, I said. How would you assess my brother's progress? I asked, changing the subject. Miraculous would be the first word to come to mind, she said. Again there was a tone to her voice, suggested that she perhaps had more to say on the matter than would be prudent. And the second? I asked. Remarkable, she said. It would seem that your ordeal was a catalyst for his own recovery. I know that he nearly worships the ground upon which you walk. It is my belief that the thought of losing you is what brought his mind back to us from whatever place it had gone to seek refuge. I nodded. I suspect that Dr. Meacham feels much more the same. Yet you seem to be troubled, she said. I stopped and considered the idea that the same Dr. Meacham had suggested a week prior. With my brother on the mend, we find ourselves needing your services as a nurse retreating. But both myself and Theodore have grown quite fond of having you in our lives. I straightened up. I let my words sink in before I continued. Perhaps it is time we considered, if you are agreeable, to changing your status in our lives. I'm unsure of what you speak, Captain McNaughton. Her tone was neutral. How do you feel? Would you be agreeable? I found myself at a loss for words. Would your mother be willing to consider it appropriate for me to call you on this Sunday after church? I could see the implications of what I had asked begin to surface in her mind. To what purpose? She said. As a gentleman would call on a lady, I told her. I realise that there is a considerable age difference between us, but it is not unheard of. And if you are not agreeable, then we can sort out some other arrangement for your services. Please don't misunderstand me. It is not my intention of turning you out of our employ, should you not be agreeable. She blushed rather prettily and then said, Oh, I would be honoured, Captain McNaughton. I am also quite certain that my mother would be agreeable. Taking her arm in mine, I returned us to the journey towards her home. As we walked along in silence, in my own soul, I could feel the beast that resided there reach out and touch something in Miss Beaumere. It seemed to be pleased with the match. And that left me wondering which of us would be in control come the next full moon. I was deep in my own thoughts when I realised that we had reached our destination in a comfortable silence. I noted that it was somewhat past supper, and so I asked if her mother might be available for a word. With a smile and a nod, she took my arm from hers and pushed the white picket gate open, and nearly glided up the front stairs to the two-storey home that had seen far better days, and disappeared inside. I waited outside the gate courteously until what seemed like far longer than I suspected actually was. Miss Beaumere and her mother came out onto the porch. Mrs. Beaumere, the eldest, had in her day been a beauty, all of her own. Now, her long blonde hair had been turned to silver, and the lines that marked her face spoke volumes of her history as a southern matriarch. Her dress was of style that even been popular for older women when I left to join General Lee, but was clean and impeccably kept. Elveria tells me that you would like to speak to me, Captain McNaughton. I do, Mrs. Beaumere, I said with a bow. Won't you come inside to the parlour? She asked with a faint smile as we both struggled with the niceties that tradition demanded to be met. Under ideal circumstances, it would have been father speaking to father about this. But alas, the recent unpleasantness with the North had left us both bereft of the patriarchs of our families. I would be honoured, ma'am, I said, pushing the gate open. After leaving my coat and hat by the door, I followed the two women into the main parlour. Again, I could see the signs of a family struggling to maintain its dignity and some modicum of its old status in spite of the theft of a wealth by our conquerors. The room was clean and cosy. A small fire was banked in the fireplace, and a large oval rug in the middle of the room had been carefully stitched to mend several unravels. Can I offer you some coffee, Captain McNaughton? She said. I'm afraid it's more chicory than coffee, but it would be my great pleasure if you would join me for a cup. I smiled and replied, I will take coffee with you, madam, and consider myself fortunate for the opportunity. She smiled and turned to Elvira and said, Won't you bring us 3 cups, my dear? Of course, mother, the blonde said, gathering her skirts and disappearing through another door that I suspected led toward the kitchen. Please, sit down, Captain McNaughton, she said, indicating a beautiful Queen Anne piece that had somehow escaped both the bombers and the taxman. Sitting, I told her, "Thank you." "You wish to ask me something?" Nodding, I said, "Yes, ma'am. I was wondering if it would be agreeable to you and your family if I began to call on Miss Elvira in a more traditional manner." "Traditional manner?" she asked. "It is best that we be clear about these things." "I understand," I told her. "For the purpose of courting for the appropriate amount of time until such a time as a marriage can be arranged." The woman sighed and said, "I am afraid, Captain McNaughton, that what dowry Elvira might have had was stolen from us by the occupation. We have very little to offer you in a traditional sense." I nodded and said, "That is understood, madam. But Miss Elvira has already paid me, in a coin of kindness, that it would be necessary for me to work a lifetime to repay. She has given me back my brother Theodore, and for that I will always be grateful. It is still unseemly for her to come to you with no fortune of her own, Captain McNaughton," Mrs. Beaumere told me. "We Beaumares are a proud family who trace our lineage back to Isolde of Brittany." "Perhaps something can be arranged with property?" I asked. "What have you in mind?" the matriarch asked warily. "I understand that your family owns the stretch of land running south of the Alligator Bayou to the north shore of the Perdido River." "Referring to the property as land is being generous, Captain McNaughton. It is a swamp under 3 feet of water for half the year," Mrs. Beaumere told me. "It is valuable to me," I told her. "Why?" she asked. "Because it creates a buffer between where I am constructing my new home and elements of our current situation with which I want no contact. I have heard on more than one occasion that you have washed your hands of our former slaves and refused any dealings with them. I only wish that I had the same opportunity." I smiled at her and said, "Miss Beaumere, you and Elvira will always be welcome at Bon Travail." She returned my smile and said, "Thank you for that kindness, sir." Then, returning to our original subject, she asked, "You would really consider that unpleasant piece of swampland as an appropriate dowry?" "To the extent that I would consider purchasing it from you, should you reject my offer of marriage between Miss Elvira and myself, something I generally hope you do not do." "I think we can come to an agreement on that." "I am most pleased, and I believe that Elvira will be as well," I told her. "She is." Then we talked of small things while awaiting Elvira's return. The coffee was indeed 2 parts chicory to 1 part coffee, but it was hot and it was appreciated. I left the Beaumares about an hour later and returned home where I considered my next move. The match was a good one, and I believe my father would have approved. As the elder Mrs. Beaumere had indicated, they came from a strong and noble French stock, as did my grandmother on my father's side. That night my dreams were haunted, and much in the same manner as those I had had the night I escaped Merlin Holmwood's clutches. I was a great cat hunting the night. In this particular case, I found myself stalking through the weeds and canebrake at the edge of the Dog River where Teddy and I had begun fishing. The reek of the unwashed man scent filled my nostrils, overpowering even the natural muskiness of the damp earth. In the distance, I could hear men talking loudly and singing. As I drew closer, I began to make out words: Liberty, Lincoln, Loyal, and League, said with the solemnity of a pastor praying over chicken dinner. It was followed by a rather poor rendition of Mrs. Ward's perversion of John Brown's body in a form of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. It would seem that the beast had stumbled upon a meeting of the Union League. The hated song's lyrics raised an anger in the beast's mind that far exceeded anything I had experienced only a few weeks past. There was a deep, abiding hatred for the men currently screeching out the words that would be satisfied with nothing less than the heart's blood. In one smooth motion, the cat's body flowed upward as its gait changed from 4 legs to 2. Looking down, I saw paws that were far more human than cat-covered in a dusty white fur. 4-inch claws extended from slits inside the ends of the finger-like digits. I watched as long arms reached out to part the reeds to reveal a gathering of several freedmen being led in a song by a white man that I did not recognize. A brakeman's lantern was set atop a large rock and illuminated half a dozen Africans standing in a semicircle, the sluggish dark water of the Dog River at their back. Next to the lantern were 2 pieces of parchment and a cheap sword marking the rock as some kind of altar. Outrage, anger, and fury rose up in a beast's soul at the thought of these men being anywhere near where Teddy might travel, of the danger they represented to my little brother. A low growl swelled up from deep in his chest, expelling its hatred and anger outward into a cry that cut through the night. It was 1 part scream, 1 part howl, and wholly inhuman. The sound of it cut through the nearby woods and canebrakes, silencing the natural sounds of the forest. As the cry died down, only the gently lapping of the water against the riverbank was evident. Under that gentle sound, I could hear the beat of several hearts. As their hearts pounded in their chest, the men slowly turned in dread towards the canes in which the cat was hiding. The leader reached for the cheap sword as the freedmen backed away towards the river bank. Powerful legs squatted and then sprang forward, arms spread wide, claws extended. The beast hurtled over the cane and slammed feet first into the leader of the group. I could feel its claws bite deep into his shoulders, and then his back as the weight of the giant beast bore him to the ground, snapping his spine in the process. Numb hands released the sword as the giant man-cat lashed to the left and right to grab the head of a freedman and each clawed hand. With inhuman and immortal strength, those claws swept the head from their bodies and smashed them together, over and over. The makeshift altar, pouring blood and brains over the items gathered upon it. I noted a small hiss as the blood spilled onto the hot vent cap of the lantern. As one, the remaining 4 took off into the dead run, whatever solemnity of the evening forgotten in the rain of the blood and brains. 2 headed upriver towards the bay, and the 2 other headed downriver towards Tillman's corner, their bare feet beating a hasty retreat. In a display of raw power, the man-cat scooped up the large stone, tumbling the parchment and the lamp to the moist earth, and hurtled it towards the men, 2 men, heading upriver. Over a ton of granite, 2.5 feet across, hurtled through the night air, slamming into both men, killing one and clipping the other, leaving him with severe injuries. Turning upriver, the man-cat dropped into a ground-devouring gate that was partially upright, but was assisted by its foreclaws on every other step. The 2 men ran headlong into the corpse of Prickly Ash. I could hear their hearts race. I could smell the rancid man scent of their spore. And now I could smell their blood as the thorns of the devil's walking stick took their toll for the intrusion. With a low growl of satisfaction, the man-cat stalked the edge of the thicket. The men tried to remain silent, but their breaths echoed on the night air around me. Their scent wafted on the breeze, and the cat's eyes could clearly see their darker outline amongst the tall, thick stalks of the thorny bushes. Stepping back away from the thicket, the cat breathed in purposefully and deeply, and let out another scream that it blasted towards the thicket where the men sought refuge. The inhuman cry had an immediate effect on one of the freedmen. In high panic, he pushed his comrade aside, shoving him out of the thicket as he bolted deeper into the painful shrubs. The unfortunate companion looked up from the moist earth where he was kneeling on all fours. Fear and pain etched their presence across the blubbering dark face, and with a swift swipe of the clawed hand, the man-cat pulled the freedman from the ground and dangled him by the gullises of his trousers, and studied him like a child with a bug. Then, slowly, deliberately, the beast grasped him across the face with one huge paw and held him aloft, his legs kicking like a poorly hanged man. And with his other paw, the beast drove its claws into the man's chest. I could hear the freedman scream incoherently into the palm of the hand-like paw as his still-beating heart was drawn from his chest. Then, dropping the man to the ground, the beast devoured the heart, relishing the blood and raw organ meat. With its lust sharpened and with the heart blood of the freedman, It turned back towards where the man had gathered and feasted on 5 more hearts. Then, in some pique of disdain, it squatted over the body of the leader and urinated all over him, marking the kill as its own. Something about that act struck me as remarkable, but for some reason I could not place what it might be. When the deed was done, the man-cat returned to its cat form and prowled its way back along the river. As I felt myself pulled from the dream, I noticed something in a nearby tree. A cloth, neatly folded, and placed there with the fastidiousness of a cat. I then awoke in my own bed, covered in sweat and aroused as I had not been since my own youth. Checking my watch by the light of the lamp, I realized it was nearly 5 in the morning. Soon it would be time to make ready for the day and awaken the house. With Miss Elvira's status now changed, it would be of a necessity for me to take on those tasks until I could find a suitable estate captain. Perhaps there was a young man in town who could take over the duties. I would find a suitable estate captain. I would have to speak with my solicitors about it. With a strange energy I had not experienced before, I rose from my bed and set about my morning ablutions. I am not sure what surprised me more, the fact that I could see no sign of blood on my face or the definite taste of it I found in my mouth. By the time the sun was rising, I had most of the fire started and had lain out Theodore's appropriate clothes for the day. It would be necessary for me to speak to him of my plans for his nurse. I knew he had developed certain feelings for her, but I was unsure if they were as poignant as they might have seen, or might have been were he older. It was a bridge that we would have to cross together. For now, I simply told him that Miss Beaumere would be taking a few days off, but that he would probably see her on Sunday. It was late in the morning when a pounding at the door summoned me from the parlour. It was not the polite knock of someone making a social call, but the demanding raps of an authority held barely in check. Opening the door, I was surprised to see Colonel Shepherd standing on my front porch. "How might I be of service to the Union Army?" I asked coldly as I held open the door for him. "There were several killings last night, Captain McNaughton. 4 of them were former slaves held by your family." "And how does this news concern me?" "I have made it clear that they are no longer on my property, made so by the Union Army and that damnable Illinois lawyer. So they are no longer my responsibility. 1 other freedman and the local schoolmaster were also counted among the victims." The colonel was obviously highly irritated as he began pacing the floor of the parlour. "Exactly where were you last night?" "Am I to assume I'm a suspect? I would say find the man who did it and buy him a brandy." "If you were, I'd have you in irons," he said. "No, it would appear that they were killed by the same swamp cat that attacked you and Merlin Holmwood." "And this has you calling on me for what reason?" I asked. "Because I have reports that you were seen walking with Miss Beaumere late last evening. I was wondering if you'd heard or saw anything." "Might I inquire where the killings occurred?" "Yes, on the shore of the Dog River, about half a mile from here. It's in a place near a large rock where I'm told you have been seen frequenting with your brother." I nodded and smiled. "Has fishing become a crime under the occupation?" "No," he said. "But damn it, man, a small boulder weighing nearly a ton was uprooted and evidently thrown almost 30 yards. "That hardly seems likely, Colonel," I told him. "Such a feat would require siege weapons not used in combat for hundreds of years." "Yes, I'm fully aware of that, Captain McNaughton," he said. "I still fail to see why you are here questioning me," I told him with a calm voice. "Because so far, you and a single escaped freedman from the Beaumere estate are the only survivors of this monster. I can't trust the description I'm getting from the freedman. It is too fantastic of a tale. I am trying to piece together what was real and what was phantasmagorical embellishment. You are at least a trained observer." I cocked an eyebrow in his direction. "I can tell you nothing, Colonel. I walked Miss Beaumere home last night, spoke with her mother briefly, and then returned here. I have plans to visit my solicitor later in the day as I am still working towards the construction of our new home. And the nature of your discussion with Mrs. Beaumere? Private, I told him. When the news is made public, you may read of it in the social section of the Weekly Tribune. The Colonel was not quite the same social pariah that Lieutenant Turner was. He, at least, understood the niceties of polite society. He was, after all, an officer. I see, he said simply. Then, when the time comes, I would offer you my congratulations. With a simple nod I said, thank you. About the cat, the Colonel continued. If you should think of anything that might be useful, or see something that is out of place, I would appreciate it if you would let me know. The beast seems to be indiscriminate in its attacks. I will, Colonel Shepard, I replied. That's all I can ask, and, in that vein, I'll take my leave. Thank you for your time, Captain McNaughton. You're welcome, Colonel, I told him, and then saw him to the door. As fate would have it, Theodore was quite pleased with the match between myself and Miss Elvira. Again, I could see a maturity in him that was not common for youngsters his age. But then few youngsters his age had gone through the trials he has. Later that afternoon, we were sitting in the parlour discussing the situation of what expectations we both should have. What are we going to do about someone to manage the house until such a time as she can once again join us? He asked. We hire an estate captain, I told him. I mean to speak to our solicitors about that very thing later today. Until then? He asked. We muddle along as best we can. Oddly, he smiled at that. I think we can manage. So do I, I told him. Any word on when the workmen will be arriving? I'm informed that the ship was scheduled to leave Edinburgh with our first cadre 3 weeks ago. I smiled, glad to see that Theodore was taking an interest in what our plans were to rebuild our fortunes and wipe away the stain of defeat from the name McNaughton. And your plans for Bontraval? A 3-story building with 2 wings of central structure that will contain the parlour, library, kitchen and dining room. I miss the staircase from our old home, he said with a slight sigh. The plans are not chiselled in stone, Tadpole. If you want a large staircase, then we can oblige you. With a curve like the old one? His eyes lit up at the thought. I suddenly had images of him sliding down the banister when he was younger. I think we can manage that, I told him. And for lighting, can we put in coal gas lamps? I gave him a querying look. What brought this on? I asked. He shrugged and said, I've been doing a lot of reading lately. It sounds like a good idea. I chuckled and said, I think we can arrange for gaslighting. Then, with a smile, I added, anything else? Lots of books in the library, he said with an air of finality. I laughed at him and told him, done. Oh, and Dan, he asked. Yes, I asked with a smile. About the estate captain. Yes. I'm assuming it goes without saying, no freedman. It does, I told him, my voice becoming slightly on edge. Good, he said, folding his hands onto his lap. Then I'm happy. I am too, Tadpole, I told him. Are we going fishing again? Not today, I replied. As I told you, I have to speak with our solicitors this afternoon. Perhaps I can go by myself, he commented with an air of affected casualness. Not today, Teddy. I was informed this morning by Colonel Shepard that the area had violence at our fishing spot last night. It's currently overrun with men investigating the situation. His green eyes turned cold. When will we be free of these meddling outsiders? When will they return to their own homes and leave us in peace? There was a hard vehemence to his voice that no 10-year-old should have ever experienced. I don't know, Theodore, I replied. Like I told you earlier, I suspect it'll get worse before it gets better. How right I was would become more and more apparent as the date of the next full moon drew closer. Evil news was followed by evil men who came down from the north. They came down with the fiery certainty of righteousness of their course, like any fire and brimstone preacher of poor caliber and low degree. They came down with the idea in their minds to teach the Southern man how to do things correctly, and how to harness the African labour in the Northern manner. They came down to free the slave from the chains of imposed ignorance and to punish the white man. They came down as business adventures, and they had notebooks and guidebooks filled with exacting tables about costs and profits, and from them they dreamed of vast returns. They admitted that the freedmen might not work for the Southern man, but they knew in fact that he would work for them. They were puffed with pride and confidence and would tolerate no advice from experienced farmers and managers, whom they laughed at as the old way. From industrial-inspired tables, they spoke to one another much information about the new machinery useful in the cultivation of cotton, how to make best use of labour, and all the things they knew better than men who would work the land all their lives. Their capital was welcome, but their arrogance soon made them more of a liability than an asset, and when their ventures failed, the blame came to lay firmly on the Southern man for being backwards and savage. It was with these men there also came politicians from the North causing mischief and stirring up ill feelings amongst races. It was as if their destruction of the South would not be complete until they had wrested from us any last vestiges of peace and any hope of reconciliation. Their sole intention seemed to be to destroy what was left of our civilization and line their pockets in the process. And with the new radical Congress, not only were most of the educated and capable men who might recognize and steer the ship of state in a responsible manner deprived of the right to vote, but of holding office as well. And under General Pope in Atlanta, we seemed destined to be ruled by the lowest, least educated, least capable of men that were left of the former slaves, and the dregs of the Union Army who had now took their adventuring from the battlefield into halls of the government. His replacement, General Meade, offered little improvement on the matter. A week later, late October, brought the winter floods that were just starting in the Delta. The bears were climbing up into the trees, and carpetbaggers and scalawags were becoming as numerous as the mosquitoes. And a lack of children was becoming more ominous as a shadow crop of small grave markers began to grow in the countryside, as a symbol of the evils of war and the occupation. No person remarked upon it, and most cast their eyes away from the tiny markers as if they were refusing to accept yet another burden to be borne. The hardest hit of all the populations of my poor state were the children, both white and black. Children are necessarily fragile, and many had not survived the privations of war. Others found themselves orphans left by both the Union soldiers and raiders that came afterward. The famine and scarcity of such basic necessities of life as flour and meal favoured no one race over the other, and it seemed to take a certain perverse delight in taking from us our most cherished treasures, our children. Whereas many of the Southern women were left bereft of husband, son, and child by the war, and were unable to manage even a small farm on their own, many of the former slave women and children found themselves abandoned by their husbands in favour of new wives, as they would take up with their sweethearts. The latter eventually became such a problem as the Constitution Convention of the following year required that laws be passed to relieve from the pains of bigamy. Many of the freedmen politicians sent to Montgomery, children, black and white, began to disappear from our streets. It was a warm evening, and I was in Mobile proper, seeing to the shipment of materials needed for the new house, and arranging for the Scottish and Irish stonemasons to be brought over from Europe. There was also the matter of the dowry discussed with Mrs. Beaumere that had to be registered, as Miss Elvira and I made official our engagement. My business had taken me longer than I had anticipated, and found myself leaving the courthouse well past what one would consider its normal operational hours. Not only that, any government office had been truly operational since the end of the war. The grand old building that had served the city so well had been reduced to a nearly carnival-like atmosphere. Many of the clerks were illiterate, and it was well known that the best way to get something through the system was to offer a loan to the official, with the understanding that it need not to be repaid. The actual courthouse was much abused by the new officials, as in the cloakrooms and in the halls, were elected were erected whiskey shops, counters for lunch, and peanut stands. As I stepped out into the warm October air, I was immediately struck by a large gathering down at the corner where Government and Royal Streets intersect. A large bandstand had been erected, and standing on it, haranguing a group of both freedmen and whites with the red-faced form of a Yankee senator. From Pennsylvania, I seem to recall. He was in high dudgeon as words of defiance and vengeance rang from his lips like some camp meeting preacher. I have come here to talk about freedmen rights and about just confiscation of property of those who held them in bondage. I am here to talk about the rise of the New South with the freedman at its head and the white Confederate in the chains of disenfranchisement. I am here and I will be heard. I have the entire 15th Regiment at my back. I noted that he appeared to have the 15th Regiment band at his back. But of that detail, he seemed oblivious. If that's not enough, I have the entire US Army to back me up. A rumble of assent travelled through the gathered freemen. The ire of both the whites and blacks seemed to grow more. The senator continued his diatribe against men, women, and even children who never in any way harmed him. I leaned against the rail and reached for the senator's mind. Surely he could not mean the things he was saying. What I found there was a poisonous mix of hatred for the South and all of its sons, combined with an overwhelming confidence in the righteousness of his cause and the purity of his own motives. There was no reasoning with this man. He was in full throes of a religious crusade. For too many years, the idle, arrogant white plantation owner has held in his control the lash of servitude of the African people. It is time the lash change hands. It is time they felt the bite and cruel death of servitude. From the edge of the crowd, a man called, "More blacks have died from your reconstruction than ever did during the war." I watched as the police moved in to arrest him. And then a shot rang out, and then another, as part of the mob surged towards the senator, and another part surged outward. From my vantage point, I watched as the senator dove behind the speaker's chair, where he lay still, unmoving from fright. I withdrew back into the courthouse and climbed the stairs to one of the upper floors so I could watch the drama below unfold. I was not about to become involved in a riot that had broken out on the street. I would not give the Colonel Shepherdmire any opportunity to take from Theodore his lands. Reaching the roof of the building, I stood amongst the colonnade supporting the building's dome and watched the drama below unfold. My eyes had no difficulties in piercing the darkness and shadows, and I noted with some disappointment as the senator darted unscathed from the stand, running hatless back to the Royal Street towards the hotel at Battle House. I later heard from a reliable source that he demanded from a clerk there to declare, if asked, that he was out and not receiving visitors. The riot continued unabated for nearly an hour before Colonel Shepherd and the army arrived to set things straight. Several men were dead or wounded, including at least 2 boys. I shook my head at the waists as I exited the building to find a soldier stationed outside the door. "What are you doing there?" he demanded, pointing his rifle at me. "And staying out the way of the riot that ensued," I told him. "In the courthouse?" he demanded. "When the shooting began, I felt it best to get out the way as I am unarmed," I told him. "And who are you?" he demanded as he was taken off guard by my casual and perfectly truthful reply. And with a nod of my head and smile, I told him, "My name is Captain Sheridan McNaughton." "A rebel?" he asked. "I have signed my pardon, Corporal," I told him evenly. "Colonel Shepherd will want to talk to you," he said. "Sign," I told him. "Very well. Take me to your colonel." He looked at me strangely and said, "I'll take you to the sergeant and he can decide." I shook my head and told him, "No, take me to the colonel. I don't have all night." As I pronounced the last words, I focused my will into it. His own collapsed and he simply nodded and replied, "Oh, maybe you're right. I know I am." 5 minutes later, we were entering the Battle House Hotel and waiting to talk to the colonel, who was busy collecting statements from witnesses. Noting me, he walked over and said, "I didn't expect to see you in a riot, Captain McNaughton." "I wasn't," I told him. I watched it from the courthouse colonnade. However, what were you doing up there? He demanded. Trying to avoid being caught up in it, I told him. I came out of the courthouse just in time to hear the senator's colourful speech. I paused a moment and said, someone really needs to tell the senator that he best be heading back to Pennsylvania. He was barely missed at least twice tonight. He's a man more suited to the salons and clubs of Washington than to the rough and tumble life here in the South. You heard the senator's speech? He asked. Well, most of it. What can you tell me of it? The senator would make a fine camp meeting preacher. Beyond that, I have little use for his logic, or lack of thereof, his rhetoric, nor his ideas. He made several proclamations that seemed designed to create a righteous situation. He bragged of having the entire 15th Regiment behind him. I noted personally that he only had the band, and then boasted that should that prove insufficient, that he would have the entire US Army at his beck and call. And I was in the mood to make neither the senator's nor the colonel's life easier. So you believe that the senator is at fault here? I believe that he set out to create chaos and succeeded in achieving that goal. He appeared to purposefully set one group of men against another, and overestimated the regimental band's ability to protect him. Had either the balls that passed near him been aimed with any more precision, then he would be a dead man tonight, and the situation of my people would be an even more dire. So you have no desire to see the senator harmed? I snorted derisively at the notion. After listening to the senator spew vile hate and vituperation for the southern man, I wish him as much pain and agony as Providence can deliver upon him. However, I also recognize that the death of the US Senator in Mobile would cause his colleagues back in Washington to further meddle in affairs that are not theirs and punish my poor Alabama that much more. For long moments the colonel studied me as he considered my words. Finally, drawing a deep breath, he replied, You, Captain McNaughton, are one of the most frustratingly calm and honest men I have ever met. You are brought here under armed escort, managed to insult a US Senator under my protection, and then give a perfectly good reason for doing so. He paused and said, Were it not for two things, I think I would have you clapped in irons. I may still do so if you cannot produce some evidence of your business today in the courthouse. I reached inside the pocket of my jacket and pulled from it a long sheet of paper and handed it to the colonel. A receipt from a tax office showing where I paid my taxes, on Chateau de la Mer. You will note that the tax levied is for the value of the property in 1861, when there actually was a Chateau de la Mer and a considerable value in slaves that are no longer my property. I can barely read the clerk's name on the receipt. Well, that's because you have the least capable people you can find working in the government. We were forced to write out documents ourselves and then have him sign them, as he was barely literate. He was quite impressed with the size of the payment. And where did you come up with $7,500? He asked. Funds from Europe, I told him. That again? That again, I replied. I'm curious as to two reasons. What two reasons? For not clapping me in irons. Oh, that. The first is because you have a reputation for honesty, even to the point of your own detriment. Secondly, because it corroborates with what other witnesses have told me, and I know you're a trained observer. Thank you, I told him. What are your plans for the rest of the evening? He asked. I intend to ride back to Bayou Menu. I would rather not leave Theodore alone, as the violence here in the city might spill over there. Fine, he told me, his mind already moving back to how to deal with the political damage tonight's riot may have caused. Looking over at the corporal, he said, Take Captain McNaughton to his horse and see that he makes it safely to the road heading south out of the city. Yes, sir, the corporal replied, snapping to the attention. The ride home proved to be long and slow after that, and I could not get the feeling from my mind that I was being observed. My eyes could detect no follower, but my mind kept insisting that someone was tracking me. And to the end, on at least two occasions I paused in a copse of trees by the roadside to see if anyone passed, but it was to no avail. The time was well past 2 o'clock when I arrived home, to find Theodore awaiting me in the parlour. He had a rather worried look upon his face. Leaving my coat and hat in the hall closet, I looked around and said, "Good morning, Tadpole," noting a look of relief on his countenance as I entered the room. I asked, "Is there a problem? Has something happened?" He shook his head and said, "No." "Then why do you appear quite relieved to see me?" I asked. "Because of the sounds of gunfire coming from the city, and because you were out there in it." His voice was clearly worried. I smiled and told him, "You are tired. You shouldn't have stayed up until I returned. The last time I went to bed before you returned, you came back the next day unconscious and severely wounded." His voice became nearly accusatory. "Well, I'm home now," I said with a smile as I rested my hand on his shoulder. "We're both safe and sound, and in need of a good night's rest." Nodding, he embraced me suddenly and said, "Don't get yourself hurt, Dan." I stroked his chestnut hair and told him, "That is not my intention, Tadpole." "Good," he said with a quick squeeze to my waist. "Now let's seek out our beds and see what dreams await us," I told him as I dampened the oil lamp by the divan where he was been sitting and directed him upstairs to his bed. My dreams that night were troubled, like a man trying to stand on shifting sand. They alternated between being a cat as it hunted prey and being pursued by it. I slept fitfully and finally arose near sunrise for hopefully the last time in a while, as I was scheduled to meet with one of the candidates my solicitor sent over for a position on the estate captain. This would be the fourth man I would interview. My standards were exceedingly high, and Miss Beaumere had set them thus. Teddy rose and dressed himself this morning and did not even need my assistance with attaching his articulated wooden leg. I was a bit surprised when he joined me in the kitchen for a light breakfast of eggs gathered from several chickens we kept in a coop out back, some sausage that was made from a couple of feral hogs that I managed to acquire, and 2-day-old bread toasted on the top of a Franklin stove. Sipping some hot coffee that was not too far from the same mixture of chicory Mrs. Beaumere had shared with me, he winced at the taste and looked up at me with sandy eyes. "My dreams last night were strange." "How?" I asked, wondering if he was beginning some kind of transformation himself. "I dreamt I was a fish," he said, "or at least part fish. I swam in the ocean and up local rivers, but instead of legs, or in my case a leg, I had a long fish's tail." "You dreamt you were a merman?" "Something like that," he said. "I was playing tag with 2 large white cats, one of which was sometimes a hawk, an owl, or an eagle that was of the same hue as the cats." Keeping my voice neutral, I said, "Ah, really? What do you think that was about?" He shook his head and with a teasing smile replied, "That maybe my older brother shouldn't stay out until the hours of the morning and leave me at home worried." Sticking my chin in the air, I said, "Consider me duly chastised." "Good," he said. "I mean it, Dan. You're all I have left." It was clear my brother was feeling the loss of our parents and sisters keenly. I walked over and knelt in front of him, my hand resting gently on his shoulder. "I'll make you this promise, Teddy. I won't leave you, and I won't let anything happen to you. I swear it on the heart's blood of our family. You and I are all each of us has left. If things become too unbearable, or someone tries to take me from you, I will find you, and we will go away where they will never find us." Eyes brimming with tears, he said, "Thank you, Dan. I'll hold you to that. Now a question for you, brother. Are you happy with the plans I've made to build a new home? I know we talked about things you want out of it, but is there something else you want that is within my power to give?" He shook his head and said, "No, only that you stay with me, Dan. Don't leave me again." "I won't, Tadpole," I told him. "You're stuck with me until I send you off to college." "Not in the north," he declared. "Heaven forbid." We both laughed. "Have you thought about what kind of servants you want to hire?" he asked me, suddenly changing the subject. I shook my head and said, Not specifically. I'm beginning to realize that Miss Beaumere did the work of 5 people. I think that if I can find a competent estate captain, I will give him a list of what we need and let him do the hiring. I understand that is the way of things in Europe. I agree, Teddy said. The house is too quiet. I was unable to avoid chuckling at that comment. This coming from a boy who misses sliding down the banisters of a staircase. Suddenly, he became very still. With wary eyes, he looked over at me and asked, "How did you know about that?" I shrugged and lied. Father mentioned it in one of his letters to me. Nodding, he returned to his eggs and we ate the rest of the meal in silence. After cleaning the dishes ourselves, I told him, "I think that among the positions I want filled is a tutor for you. From what I've been reading in the papers, I don't trust the conflict between Putman and Smith that has left our schools in disarray. I would shudder at what kind of education you might receive in those schools." Again, he nodded and said, "I just have one request when it comes to a tutor." "Okay, and that is?" I asked in awe of the audacity he had shown me this morning and last evening. "No religionist," he said. "I want a tutor who will teach me math, literature, grammar, languages, natural science and history. I would prefer to leave the religion to the ministers." I was nearly in shock at his tone, the maturity of his words, and how well spoken he was. I agreed almost immediately out of shock and awe, if nothing else. It was 2 in the afternoon when I was sitting down with a gentleman of my own age who not only carried himself with quite a strength of dignity, but a bushy head full of copper, red hair, and a slight Irish accent as well. His name was Donovan, and he had come to America searching for greater opportunities than were to be had in the British Isles. Finding it difficult to secure employment with the rich families of New England, he chose to move south and seek unlikely employment here. When I asked him about the wisdom of this, his reply was, "Over the centuries, my family has served the noble houses of Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales. Many of the great families here in what you call Dixie migrated from those areas of the empire. I think that my own principles would be more appreciated here than in the New England states, and there is a natural distrust of the Irish in those states that must be dealt with. Well, part of the position will require you to engage the services of an appropriate staff for the house here, and eventually for Bon Travail." I could see in his mind questions about my being able to afford such a house, but his sensibilities of an estate captain overrode his desire to ask them. "Also, a tutor for my younger brother, who is 10. On that engagement, I will hold final word of who is chosen, but we do not wish a tutor with religious inclinations. An unusual preference, but it is one of which I can work. If you are willing to engage a tutor from Europe, I believe I have someone in mind who will fit your requirement. It would seem that most of my employees are coming from there. I have no objections. But one final note. As you know, I am a former Confederate officer from the Army of Northern Virginia. That places my household under closer scrutiny from certain quarters in the current occupational government. Your discretion must be as keen as a blade." He shook his head and said, "I understand such restrictions quite well, sir. Disclosure of the family information will be a dark spot on my own honour. I will be the soul of discretion." "I am glad to hear it. I have one other requirement about staff, and that is, no freedmen are to be hired or even on these premises. If you can agree to that final requirement, I think I would like to employ you at a salary mentioned by my solicitor." "Very well, sir. I am quite willing to take on your household for the salary that has been named and within the parameters you've laid out." "When can you start?" I asked him, fully impressed with what I'd seen from both his personality and his mind. "If sir will grant me the afternoon to make arrangements with my hotel, I will be able to begin this evening." I stood and said, "I look forward to seeing you at the time, Donovan." I offered him my hand as a gentleman. "My very great pleasure, sir," he said, taking my hand with a certain brotherly grip that I recognized. Returning the grip, I smiled and said, "I did not realize that you were a travelling man. I am now certain that I have made the right choice." "I am, sir," he said with a smile. That evening, good as his word, Donovan moved in and took over the household duties, arranging to interview staff starting on the morrow. My sleep that night was surprisingly quiet and trouble-free. What dreams that came, I can't say that I remember, only that they were banal and of little consequences. By the end of the next week, Donovan was as good as his word and had installed all of the staff we discussed. Sans the tutor, as the candidate was still en route from Scotland. As the full moon drew closer, I found myself more agitated, more restless, while at the same time far more alert and reactive. More ironic was that it was a blue moon, and in that it was the second full moon of the month, and it fell on All Hallows Eve, a night dedicated to anarchy, mischief, and when the spirits of the other world were close to this one. I remembered how superstitious the slaves had been before the war, and how they would nearly soil themselves at some of the pranks the boys would play on them on that night. I suspected the anarchy that was evident in the government was going to add to that chaos and encourage anarchists of a more professional bent than rowdy schoolboys onto bigger and more destructive acts on the night. I was glad for the presence of Donovan and the most excellent staff he'd hired, as I knew that I was not going to be available to keep vigil. Again, I made my arrangements with 2 local constables to keep an eye out on things, and I spoke with Donovan about my being out of pocket, as they say, for a few days. As I said, my mood became agitated, nearly manic as Saturday approached. I focused that energy into positive pursuits and managed to get far more done in those few days than I had in most weeks. I had toured the site where the wall was going and discovered that changes would be necessary made to the plans on that front. The ground would not hold the mass of the wall as I described to Colonel Shepherd, so we settled for something more prosaic. 8 foot by 2 foot of simple stone with another 10 foot of wrought iron atop. That would be installed in place of the European fortress-style wall. In the end, it would save me money, but not give me quite the security I wished for my brother. Late Saturday afternoon, I said my goodbyes to Miss Elvira and Theodore under the guise of spending a few days at work to oversee the new changes. Afterward, a driver took me out to the work site and then returned home with instructions that I should be ready to leave the site on Tuesday next. Upon arriving on the site, I gave the workmen the next 3 days off with pay and had them clear out of the premises. I wanted no innocent to come to harm should I fail to control the beast inside of me. It was going to be a close call, as moonrise and sunset were nearly the same time for this particular date. Pitching a tent on the site, I disrobed and awaited what was to come as the light grew dimmer around my camp. I noted that as darkness approached, the usual night sounds did not make their appearance. The campsite was eerily silent of crickets, birds, bullfrogs, and even the grunting of the alligators was missing. It was as if the forest was taking a deep breath in anticipation of something new, something dangerous was becoming in the night. When the night had completely fallen, I stepped outside of my tent, wearing nothing but what I was born in, and looked up into the eastern sky. It was a clear night, and although there was no clouds in the Gulf Coast sky, there was a low fog rising up from the moist earth around me. My gaze watched the eastern horizon as the moon began to make an appearance above the treetops of the swamp. It was huge, far larger than I had expected it to be, and in its cold, silvery light caressed my body like an old lover. I had no idea what I expected from the change. Pain, probably, as my bones and muscles began to shift and change. Itching, too. I could not imagine becoming a creature of fur and furry without my skin at least being irritated. But there is a fine line between agony and ecstasy, and to this day I cannot say for sure on which side of that line was the experience. Like a hauntingly familiar tune that was just outside of the touch of memory, a steady thrumming permeated my body and played against my nerves. With a feeling of elation and agonizingly slow pain, I felt my eyes transmogrify as my vision sharpened and shifted just before the world became clear as all the colour drained from it, only to produce new colours I could not identify. as I felt the same pustules I'd experienced at the Merlin Holmwood's laboratory of torture raise on my scalp and burst within seconds. I felt the raw agony against my scalp and deep into my brain, and it was instantly followed by a release not unlike that experienced in moments of most intimate passion. A series of sharp, fiery pains shot through my body as my bones unlocked themselves from their original positions, followed by a battery of the same ecstatic release as they slid into place of the new form. Muscle and sinew grew and expanded along my form, echoing the two-point dance of agony and ecstasy in the rest of my body. I looked down at my hands as the ground retreated beneath them, as my body began to grow and expand. Slowly, my fingers elongated and my hands grew larger and harder. Claws, like the ones I remembered from Merlin Holmwood's place, slid out of the hidden sockets in my fingers, and a low purr of satisfaction escaped my throat as I reached up and felt the second set of ears atop of my head. Giddy with the raw power that the moon seemed to be pouring into my body, I began striding towards the river at the edge of the property, leaving bits and pieces of my old self behind as my new form crystallized around me. Crossing the field, I found an old game trail that led past what had been our rice fields and towards the river. Reaching its end, I could see where it forked north and south to run parallel to the Perdido. Stopping at the fork, I used a water oak sapling to balance myself as I leaned out over the water to see what my reflection looked like. I was astounded to see my body had become a much larger. Thick sinew and muscle was apparent under the short creamy fur that covered it. My head and face was some strange merge of a cat, a large cat, and a human, and my mouth was full of sharp teeth, punctuated by longer, leaner upper and lower canines. My ankles had elongated so that I was walking on my toes, and my knees jutted upwards and forward, giving me the appearance that they were on backwards. A long white tail snaked out from behind me, curling and uncurling. The beast inside of me slowly moved to the front of my consciousness to take up residence alongside the part of me that was the man. And then the two merged into one being. As the moon bathed me in its silvery light, I took a deep breath, threw back my head, and roared a warning into the night. This land belonged to me and my pride, and I would protect it from those who would defile it, and the spirits who here rested. As the last echo of that roar, that was one part challenge and one part call, died on the fog around me. The land finally let out its own breath, and the night sounds returned to the swamp and forest around me. With the merger of the man and beast in my mind and soul, I realized that neither side was in complete control. The first change had come while the man was unconscious, so the beast had been free of rein. Now, the man guided the beast, and the beast gave its strength to the man in a perfect balance of power and responsibility. Joy welled up in my soul as I could feel so much potential that was released. Knowledge I had not known was there, unfolded itself in my mind. Not just knowledge of the world around me that the beast's senses granted me, but knowledge of the forms of the witcheries. It was as if they were waiting on my acceptance of what was happening to reveal themselves. Or perhaps the beast brought more to the table than I had realized. There would be a time to discover them later, but for now, I think that the beast had more than earned the right to play. With long lopes, I began to explore the swamp, and in the distance, I could hear the sounds of bare feet walking along the path. Curious as to who it was, my form shifted down again to that of a large white painter, and began to track the sound. There should be nobody anywhere near this parcel of land, as from the edge of the alligator bayou to the bay, it all belonged to Teddy. So, on silent cat feet, I began to stalk the sound. As I rounded the bend heading north, I discovered a small john boat moored to the stump. Following the sounds of the footsteps, I headed westward away from the river to where the slave graveyard was. Much to my surprise, I saw Miss Beaumere and her mother silently gathering leaves and flowers from plants growing along the wall of the cemetery. I stepped back into the thick foliage of the hardwood trees and watched as they kept looking over their shoulders at the moon as they quickly gathered the plants they wanted. I was unsure as to exactly what they were after, but I saw no harm in their harvest. The beast had already made its mind on the matter known. It approved of Miss Beaumare. After about half an hour, they headed south again toward the site of the old Chateau de la Mer. I stayed well back from them, watching in curiosity as they seemed to communicate silently with each other. Going to the old oak tree that had stood in the front of the main house for as long as the house had been there, they quickly gathered several pieces of bark, fresh leaves and acorns from it. Then, as quietly as they came, they headed back to the boat that had brought them here. Again I followed them, out of curiosity as to what they would do next. Reaching the edge of the woods near their small boat, they stopped and strained their ears to listen. It was then that I stopped and realized that the night sounds had once again changed. Many of the creatures of the night had not so much gone silent, but had instead softened their calls to something more cautious. I stopped and listened as well. That was when I heard the grunts and groans of men disembarking from another boat. Their conversations became instantly interesting to me. "Sir, woman's boots!" A voice loud enough for any to hear. "Pipe down, Juba!" Another voice said, in an English accent, that I identified him as a member of the gentry. In a softer voice he noted, "And expensive ones at that. Now, why would two women go traipsing around the swamp and these ruins in their bare feet?" "Maybe for the same reason as us," a third voice said softly. "Looking for the McNaughton's treasure. Tompkins, you best hope that McNaughton never finds out that you and Wilkerson circled back with those bombers and raided the house again." At that, a hot stab of fury shot through my mind, and the beast became more powerful in my soul. "It was under yours and Canby's orders," the treasure seeker protested. Evidently, he was Tompkins. The anger became a white-hot poker, prodding the beast forward. It was all I could do to keep from screaming my anger into the night. As it was, a low, guttural growl escaped from somewhere deep in my chest. At the sound, I saw Elvira suddenly look towards the shadows where I was hidden. A knowing smile came across her face. She brought her forefinger to her lips in a hushing motion, and then turned back to listen to the men. The gesture caught me so completely off guard that I felt my fury begin to subside, and the beast relinquish its control. Whoever was in charge chuckled and said, "Somehow I believe McNaughton isn't likely to believe you, or even care. All that would do is add myself and Canby to the list of names he's going to personally ruin." "You can't believe he's going to go that far," Tompkins protested. "He's done nothing but take care of that brat. We should have killed him when we had the chance." "You, Tompkins, are definitely a man of low degree," their commander said. "I can and do. McNaughton is a man cut from an entirely different cloth than most others. He has set his cap for revenge, and is making plans within plans. He's managed to recover his fortune and hold on to his property. Furthermore, he's managed to clear out his lands of the former slaves and kept them from squatting here. He's the only person who is importing food and dry goods to this city, and is probably making a tidy profit from it. Don't underestimate McNaughton." "The boat's secured, Milford Westall," another voice said. "Westall? Who the hell was Lord Westall? Let's head out. I believe the McNaughton family crypt is this way." There was a long silence broken only by the sounds of a boat, a dory, I suspected, scraping along the river bank, and the shuffle of boots in the thick mud along the river. As I listened, I watched the Beaumares slip silently up the game trail back towards the slave graveyard. I moved to interpose myself between them and the men who were currently shuffling towards the way from which we had come. When I was sure they were out of sight and around the bend, I turned back towards the men that were seeking the McNaughton treasure. At the thought of the conversation I just heard, the fury once again began to rise in me, At least one of the men who was responsible for what happened to my family was in that little search party, and his name was Tompkins. Quietly, I fell in behind the double column of Union soldiers, led by a man on horseback who was wearing no uniform. They slogged along the trail by the pale moonlight. On silent pause, I slipped up behind the man coming up the rear. He never knew what hit him. One huge clawed paw swept across his face and then twisted his head violently until it turned around to face me. I could already see death in his eyes as I gently lay his body on the roadside and slipped into the woods alongside the path. Twice more, I repeated the process, each time leaving a man lying in the high grass. It was on my fourth attempt that all hell broke loose. Suddenly, in front of the column, a huge white painted cat, the size of a pony, landed in the pathway, startling the men up front. It threw its head back and screamed into the night. That horrible sound that no human throat could ever make, but still evoked the imagery of a screaming woman. Then it stood up and flowed into the man-cat form, and with a single blow swept the two lead men out of their formation and close to itself. Then came the roar of gunfire as the other cat bit deeply into the juncture of the neck and shoulder of the first man. Shaking its head, it tore out the man's throat and then ripped away the muscles of his shoulder. He screamed once and then collapsed to the ground, blood spurting from the wound as he writhed in agony in the soft earth. The claws of its other hand, like paw, closed around the head of the other man and lifted him off the ground, his feet kicking vainly in the air. The other creature squeezed his skull while it fed on his partner. First was the crunching sound of the skull bones being crushed, followed by the squish of the bones and brain matter being driven through each other. The two men in the rear stepped to the side and lowered their Springfields, aimed them at the other man-cat and fired! I watched as two .58 caliber musket balls slammed into it at point-blank range. The cat took a moment to look up from its bloody meal to give me an inquiring look, as if to ask me if I were going to do something. Taking my cue from the look, I reached out my hand towards each of them. The claws on my hand like paws extending outwards so that when I swept the men in close, they hooked into the sides of their faces. I heard an audible snap as I broke the neck of the man on my right, followed by the impact of his head into that of the other man. There was a loud pop, and then squishing sound of ripping and tearing of flesh as I peeled the other man's face from the bones of his skull. I then kicked out at him with a clawed foot and opened him from his sternum to his waistline. As he toppled over, his entrails began to fall from his body, steam rising in the cool night air from them. Looking over where the other cat creature was laying about the remaining soldiers, I screamed into the night myself. The sound echoing so close to them sent the remaining men into a panic. Half turned around and saw me closing with them as my counterpart closed from the front. Claws and fangs tore into the men, ripping away flesh and crushing bone until only their leader was still standing. He looked to be of a middling age, not quite having reached a point where his virility was lessened, but instead carried an aura of might and power about him. He had dark hair and eyes, and I am unsure if the paleness of his skin came from a natural state or from the sight of his men being reduced to raw meat to feed the great beasts around him. Seeing himself trapped between the two of us, he threw up his arms and seemed to shimmer for a second in the cold light of the harvest moon, just before his body contracted into a tight ball of shadow. He became a large bat and then flew off towards the west, dropping to all fours. I turned and followed him. The beast demanded more details on who was at Chateau de la Mer that fateful night. As I fitted into the tree line about a mile away, the beast inside me realized it was a vain chase as things were. I, however, demanded answers and remembered the other form from my first change. At a ground-devouring run and then a leap of high into the moist autumn air, I willed the change into mid-leap. There was a spike of pleasure and pain as my body expanded outward. My arms became long feathery wings and my face became flat with a sharp beak and large eyes. My feet and legs contracted up to bear razor-sharp talons as off-white feathers covered my body. The owl could see far better in this light than the cat as I wheeled and soared over the forest looking for any sign of the bat that had entered it. Several times my talons struck at movement in the treetops, but found only normal bats and birds, not the creature that had been a man on the ground below. And for hours I watched the forest until the first signs of the false dawn began to appear on the horizon. In frustration, I returned back to the site of the battle to find some of the bodies had been fed upon. Dropping out of the sky, I once again became the great cat and ate my fill of the man-flesh before returning to my tent and collapsing inside, exhausted and satiated. It was just after true dawn that I awoke, once again myself. I cleaned myself up and then burned the bloody cloth I'd used to do the job in my fire. I dressed and returned to the scene of the massacre. Shaking my head, I went to the sites where the 2 boats were supposed to be, but found only the dory that the soldiers had arrived in. Assuming that the Beaumares had escaped the battle, I began walking along the road that had once connected Chateau de la Mer to the burgeoning municipality of Gulf City. I was going to have to report this incident. I would weave for Colonel Shepard a tale of gunfire and animal screams in the night, and of waiting until daybreak before reporting it. He would believe it. My witcheries would see to that. But I had a few questions for Elvira and her mother that I would like to have answered. Finally, I had the name of a man who had information I wanted. We were going to have some rather pointed conversations about those names, and he would give them to me. His name was Westhall, and we had a date with destiny. Wow, absolutely awesome, intense, and just wonderfully written stuff there, Wayne. Thank you so much, brother, for your incredible work and allowing me to do a rendition of my own. As ever, guys and girls, please do let us know down below in the comments what you thought. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And of course, don't forget to hashtag Team Fear. I hope you're all well and happy and had a wonderful working week, and are looking forward to a relaxing weekend with family, friends and good food. And above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.